Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our KuppingerCole webinar, Managing the User's Consent Lifecycle, Challenges, GDPR Compliance, and Business Rewards. This webinar is supported by iWelcome. The speakers today are me, Martin Kuppinger. I am CEO, founder, and principal analyst at KuppingerCole, and Corné van Rooij, who is Vice President, Product and Strategic Alliances at iWelcome. Before we start, some general information about KuppingerCole and some housekeeping information. KuppingerCole is an analyst company. We were founded back in 2004, providing neutral advice, expertise, thought leadership, and practical relevance, focused on areas, in particular, information security, identity and access management, governance, but also a lot of other areas concerning the digital transformation. So our roots, so to speak, are in identity and information security, but we cover an increasing number of other topics around that. Our services include a couple of business areas. So we do research, such as our leadership compass documents, which compare vendors in their offerings in a certain market segment, but also how-to guides, advisory notes, and a lot of other stuff. We do events. So we do, and I'll talk about this in a minute, including our webinars, but also a couple of on-site events. And we do advisory, where we act as a neutral partner and providing independent advice, for instance, in selecting products and building strategies, defining roadmaps, etc. From the events perspective, there are two important upcoming events. In fact, one series of events and one other event. So the closest one is the European Identity and Cloud Conference, which will be held in May 9th to 12th in Munich. It's the 11th edition of this conference, and it's sort of the must-attend conference around identity, security, and related topics in Europe. And then in the August to November timeframe, we will do our consumer identity world tour with 3 locations, which are Singapore, Seattle, and Paris. That's it from sort of the information about KuppingerCole and the upcoming events. Regarding the webinar, you are muted centrally, so you don't have to mute or unmute yourself. We will record the webinar, and the recording will be available latest by tomorrow. And there will be a Q&A session at the end, but you can enter questions at any time using the questions feature in the GoToWebinar control panel. That's the control panel, which is usually at the right side of your screen. The more questions we have, the more lively the Q&A session will be, so don't hesitate to enter your questions. Right now, let's look at the agenda. As usual, it will be split into 3 parts. In the first part, I will talk about how to include a compliant and business-oriented CIAM, so consumer or customer identity and access management strategy, into your identity and access management program. But I also will look at some aspects around the drivers, so the GDPR and PSD2 drivers, some organizational aspects, etc. In the second part, then Corné will talk about the different consent needs of GDPR and PSD2. And he will talk about a step-by-step approach to implement the Consent Lifecycle Management focused CIAM into your enterprise infrastructure. And consent and how to deal with consent will become one of the most interesting, fascinating challenges in that space. Okay, so let's move from here. I want to start a little bit high level with the digital transformation, because at the end, a lot of what we are seeing here, particularly around consumer identity management, is really driven by the digital transformation. And this digital transformation, yes, the buzzword of the year, not only of this year, it's a buzzword to some extent. On the other hand, it really describes a fundamental change in the way we do businesses. So there are a couple of external drivers. So amongst these external drivers, we see a changing competitive landscape. If you look at automotive vendors, where Tesla right now is a challenger to traditional automotive vendors. If you look at the changes in banks, I'll touch this later on in the context of PSD2, and in many other businesses, the competition is changing, which means you need to be more innovative. We see a lot of business models also changing from a product to a service business model. So use the car whenever you need it, but don't buy the car anymore. Everything becomes connected, and then we have this area of ever increasing attacks on one hand and the ever changing regulations on the other side. So we have more and more regulations, and some of these regulations will massively affect how we deal with customers and consumers in the future, partnerships and so on. So organizations need to be more agile, more innovative, more flexible, and we will touch this organizational aspect then when we talk about where does consumer identity management really belong. So there are some key topics. If you're a manufacturing organization, clearly it's smart manufacturing. It's the Internet of Things, and it's in particular the, so to speak, know your customer, but not only in the regulatory sense, but also in a sense of know as much as you can about your customer, serve the customer perfectly well. So there are various technologies we need to look at. And if you look at these technologies, yes, there's blockchain, there's cognitive and AI, there are sensors, but there's in particular identity. So understanding the identity of your customers, understanding the identity of things, understanding which things and devices are associated with which customer. And then on the other hand, more on the left-hand side of that picture, the security and privacy. So we have this change, which is one fundamental evolution we are facing today. The other is that we also see a change in many industries regarding the regulatory burden. And I used here the finance industry because the finance industry clearly is the ones which is most under pressure. So back in the year 2008, 2009, with the financial crisis, a lot of regulations were either introduced or massively tightened. With further additions made over time in the next years, Basel III affecting the capital side of banks became effective a little later. Then we had in 2015, for instance, in Germany, the IT security law becoming effective, which looks at the critical industries, and finance, amongst many other industries, is considered being a critical industry. And the cost of compliance, the total cost of compliance was growing and continues to grow. And right now, within the next 14 months, we will have two other important regulations in the EU becoming effective. One is PSD2, and the other is the EU GDPR. So PSD2 is the payment service, the revised payment services directive. So this PSD2, the second one, and the other, the EU GDPR, is the General Data Protection Regulation. And they will lead to an ever-increasing cost of compliance, and we will have changes in that space. And what we also should think about when we look at all this is not only what does it mean as a burden, but which is the common approach, follow the regulator, follow the auditor, but also look at how could we change sort of the game here in the sense of it. On one hand, there's the cost, it's the competitiveness. There seems to be no benefit, but is there really no benefit, or can we create such benefit? That's where I will end up then with my presentation. So this is the sort of the scenario we are in. And GDPR, as I've said, is one of these regulations. So until now, so before GDPR, every EU member state has its own data protection laws. With GDPR, we have an EU rule which is binding and which is accompanying national laws. So the point, in fact, is if it's called a regulation or a directive, so a directive says you have to do it in your legal law, in your local law. A regulation overrules the local law. There might be some exemptions, but basically that's sort of the difference. And it's even a little less than 435 days to go right now until it becomes effective. And one of the most important things in there is what I have on the lower side of the right-hand side. It binds businesses established outside the EU to the European standards when they are operating in the EU or the related economic region, which in fact means, simply said, if you want to do business with EU resident people, the GDPR applies. Even if you're based in the US, even if you're based in Asia or somewhere else. This is, I think, a very important thing. And so when we look at this, for some reason my PowerPoint shows it again, there are some key aspects to understand about the GDPR. So one of the most important ones is, unless another legal basis is in place, a written contract, in fact, consent is required prior to processing personal data. You need consent. And this consent, this is the big change in the combination, has to be freely given, informed, unambiguous, and it needs to consist of clear statements of affirmative action. So saying, oh, I use a cookie and I might do with your data whatever I want is not sufficient anymore. It's explicit, informed consent, and it's consent per purpose, which might be revoked again. So you can't say, I collect the data, and at a later point of time, you say, okay, I use it for something totally different. It's really about saying, I need consent per purpose, and if I add a purpose, I need to get the consent for this new purpose, which is a very fundamental change. Then, okay, you need data protection officers, which can be externals. There might be scenarios, or there are certain scenarios where you need to run additional data protection impact assessments. For instance, if you are supervising public places, etc., or dealing with health data. Interesting, data breach notification within 72 hours, which is a short period of time, and you need to be prepared for that. Massive data control rights, so the right to be forgotten, the right to freeze data processing of your data. So I can come and say, okay, for now, you're not allowed to use my data. I might request the data to be exported and edited. I have the right of data portability even, which is interesting because if you look at the data models, unless you have an understanding of where is which part of the PII stored, you will not be able to comply with these regulations. So if it's sprawled across a lot of systems and you don't have a clue where it really is, then you will be definitely challenged. Oh yeah, and you have to be privacy by default and design as a mandatory thing. So this sounds very massive, and it can be very massive depending on where you are today. So how big is the real impact of that? I think it's easier if there are already strong privacy regulations. The more you have to do today, the easier it is. Do you have one purpose of your business or multiple ever-changing purposes? So if you have changing purposes, you will have to ensure that you always have consent. A DPO in place, easy for Germany, where it's something you have to have. In other countries, far more difficult. There might be some country-specific exemptions which make it easier for you, but the challenge is if there are too, so sort of trying to weaken the GDPR too much, the European Court of Justice most likely will not accept these. Are you technically able to support the requirements, such as the right to be forgotten, the consent per purpose, etc.? You need a platform which supports you. You need a data model which supports this. So you really have to look at the way you work with PII, with customer data, etc. Then, based on that, you might have identified that you have major requirements to change the way you handle PII. Are your applications dealing with PII built according to the principles of security by design and privacy by design? So there are several aspects. And so if you're already rather good in dealing with privacy, the challenge will be less. If you're not as good, it will be bigger. What happens if you don't comply? Fines and sanctions, up to 4% of the annual worldwide turnover of the group, or 20 million euro, whichever is greater. So very significant. And so there are various reasons to impose a fine. I don't want to go into detail that much, but I'm absolutely sure that we shortly after the May 28th next year, we'll see a number of lawsuits starting around that, which is, I think, very, very logical because privacy is a very sensitive topic and there are various parties which are interested in such lawsuits. So this is a very high level and very quick overview of GDPR. What about PSD2? So PSD2 it's another regulation, a totally different one. The PSD2 comes into play when it's about payment services. And it changes a lot of stuff around payment services. It also means in many scenarios you have to change the way you work with customers. So, and that's where I want to come to. So there are basically two major technical requirements. One is strong customer authentication, which in most cases, with a couple of exemptions, says you have to have a two-factor authentication in place, unless it's less than 30 euros or an unattended payment machine, so like in the parking lot, etc. And you need to open APIs, in fact, as interfaces for so-called AISPs and PISPs. AISPs are account information service providers. PISPs are payment initiation service providers. So these are, in fact, other parties which are then able to do part of the business which traditionally has been done maybe by a bank. So they are called third-party providers, these two, and they can access it. The target of the EU, the explicit target of this regulation, is to foster competition. And AISPs and PISPs have less burden by regulatory compliance, so they can in fact build the interface to the customer by saying, okay, I provide something which allows you to access all accounts at all of your financial institutions, or to run all your payments through my service, which is a challenge for an established bank, because it means there's someone which sort of tries to build a face to the customer. They might be more agile than established players and take an ever-growing part of the business. It means banks, in that case, have to rethink the way they deal with customers. They need a totally different way to interface to customers. Basically, they're a little bit harsh, maybe. You can ignore and die the situations, but then your customers aren't your customers anymore. The TPPs will dictate your business model because they are the one who will bring the business. Or you get more agile, interface with other, build an interface to the customer, be the one who provides consumer identity and access management as part of that, and dictate the business model. So that also means that your organization will change, and you will have to create layers where you say, okay, you have your traditional customers and traditional services, but you also will have new banking services and new types of customers, and you will have to operate in different speed around your core banking business. So with traditional applications on the top and the modern applications sort of on the lower part of this picture. And that's where things like consumer identity and other stuff, and Corné will touch this more in his part, come into play. And we have to be clear about consumer identities are a totally different thing than enterprise. No, not a totally different thing, but they are in some areas, they are really different from enterprise identities. So for enterprise identities, you start with security. For consumer identities, you start with convenience. If you're a bank, yes, your other focus will be security, but there are really different requirements here. So to serve your customer well in the future, it's not about saying, this is the way to authenticate. It's about saying, I support everything which is good enough if you want, because make it convenient to the customer. Think authentication, all the other stuff from the customer, not from your enterprise and management view. So what you need to be successful is you need to create trust. You need to make it usable, and success will be there if you provide the alternatives to your customer. And one element of this is the shift from identity management to traditional IAM, identity access management, to consumer identity management, to a more modern, not only regulatory view on know your customer. And know your customer better should be know and serve your customer. So traditionally, we had this view on user lifecycle management, single sign-on, privilege management. With consumer identity management, the customer journey moves in the center, to the center of the attention. The relationship management, who is part of a family, etc. The adaptive authentication, the one view on the customer data integration, extremely important in the context of GDPR. All these things come into play. So it's sort of IAM at scale plus customer experience. And when we then go one step further. It's really the automated customer interaction, the analytics, but also the privacy and information protection, including the anti-money laundering stuff. So it's even one step bigger. Moving there is not easy because there are so many involved parties. There's sales, which traditionally owns the customer, and marketing with the marketing automation. There's the IT, which is the identity management. Oh yes, there might be the CDO or Chief Digital Officer, Chief Digital Business Officer, where organizations say, oh, the customer has a totally different role right now. We must serve him differently. And there are some other parties. So the website owners and developers who did the e-commerce website before, the business departments, which ran their own portals so far, the corporate audit from KYC perspective, regulatory scene, the data protection officers. So it's not easy, and you have to figure this out. You have to look at your organization. So how should your organization change? How must it change? And you can look at different ways to run a consumer identity model. It can be chaotic. So no central management will not work with GDPR and other regulations. It can be integrated. So one consumer identity management, but operated by business, or it can be more service-driven bimodal, where you say this is an IT service, but business manages and uses it, or you do it very technical and leave it in the business. I'm a big friend of doing it service-driven and bimodal here. So saying this is an infrastructure provided as a service, maybe just procured as a service, managed and used by business. Should we split or join the consumer identity management and the employee identity management? There are arguments for both variants, for a combination, for everything. My perspective is at least you should have a picture of everything, where particularly in the identity as a service space, things are a little bit converging. The most important thing here is define your sort of one IAM strategy to integrate everything well. There might be, and there will be most likely, a couple of tools, but it's about having one strategy, one approach on that. So within business, the recommendation would be having a central consumer identity management managed across all the business departments. Between business and IT, it's consumer identity as a service. And for employee identity management to consumer identity management, it should be an integrated view on it, based on more than one service, but with an integrated view. With that, I'll come to my final slides. What is also important in this entire context is start fighting the culture of compliance. So don't look at all these changes only from a negative perspective. Look at the opportunities. There are opportunities. Starting with creating agility. If you design stuff with security by design and privacy by design in mind, you're flexible to adapt to new regulations. And then also think beyond the minimum level of compliance. Do it once right, and you will be safe for a while regarding new regulations and the pressure from auditors. But you also might use it for increasing competitiveness. Yes, there's more pressure. Look at it. So when you look at PSD2, consume your own APIs and the one of others. Become a provider. Become competitive by understanding your opportunities, not only the threats. And that's true for GDPR as well. Provide a better authentication to your customer, for instance, when you're in GDPR. And for business, and when you look at GDPR, so my final slide, the business opportunities of GDPR is, there are some very obvious ones. The one is a European view, an EU view, I have to say. It means fairness and competition. So there are same regulations for everyone doing business with EU residents, regardless from where he does it. That's an opportunity for EU-based organizations. The other thing is consent means clarity. So if you have consent, then you can act on the data. Sometimes today it's more a gray area. You also need to demonstrate value to your customer to gain consent, which is a challenge, but which could also increase customer loyalty. The customer knows what you do with the data and why you need it and what he gets for it. And you also could become, when we look at data portability, the target, not only the source. With that and some of these thoughts, I hand over to Corné, who will then do the second part of the presentation. and talk about the different consent needs of GDPR and PSD2. Corné, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Welcome, everybody. My presentation will be focused on consent in the new world Martin just described. With both GDPR and PSD2, the topic consent is really on the rise, specifically around the use and the processing of personal identifiable information. You should, however, not compare this to the European Union cookie legislation, where Martin already mentioned about, where you constantly had to approve the use of cookies every time you visited a website. Consent is something you gave and will last till you withdraw it. And you can extend the purpose of a consent and reduce it. And the company needs to document it. It is as such a real life cycle topic, like we have seen in identity and access management in the past with joiners, movers, leavers in the enterprise domain. Now you have consented joiners, movers, leavers in the consumer domain. And it requires the same kind of capabilities of the management platform to offer self-service, to give transparency, to keep records, to allow changes. So nothing new in a way. Besides, it's not really a standard capability of most current identity and access management solutions. But that's going to change because they can't stay away from consent management as part of it. GDPR and PSD2 were already mentioned. They have specific consent requirements dictated by law. There are, however, two other topics I want to talk about, more market trends that are really strong on consent. That is the Internet of Things. You may not have thought of that before. And it's UMA, User Managed Access, which is a new trend or a new standard in a way. In the next slides, I will go through each of these to show where consent is a requirement and where you need to arrange something. So consent in GDPR. Martin already mentioned a couple of points, like shown either by statement, clear affirmed action, withdrawal of consent. With the GDPR, there's not only the term consent, there's also a very strict definition of what is allowed as consent. And there are many, many exceptions. If a company needs, for instance, your address to send to your home the book you just ordered, you do not need to ask consent, as it follows out of the so-called contract of buying a book. It's very clear for a consumer where the address is for, and only for that purpose and for that moment a company can use that address. So what if the company wants to store the address for any further orders, which is convenient also for the user? Then they need to ask consent, as the action of storing the data is a processing activity that is not necessary to execute the current contract, which was buying that specific book. And you don't have any future one yet in place, like buying a future book. So they have to ask consent. So here it becomes complicated in a way. Then there's an additional layer of complication when it comes to sensitive data, which can be like religion or race. A company needs to ask so-called explicit consent. And explicit in this case means that this choice has to be asked specifically and that you have to take a separate action, like ticking another box to confirm. So you get a slower response basically with more tick boxes to get real confirmation. And of course, companies need to put that and document it. GDPR also dictates companies need to keep track of all consents given. And that you have to take, so all consents given. It should be auditable for auditors and transparent for consumers. And you can't ask consent for something you should be freely given. And if not freely given, don't deliver a service as a result of it. So you can't basically dictate consent and then say, if you do not press these buttons, if you do not allow us using this, then we're not going to enroll you to the service. Unless in certain cases where you can prove that you need that kind of information. Think of birth dates because you're having online media like movies and there's an age restriction on that specific movie. And there's a law dictating that. Which brings me to the next topic. You can't ask consent to a child that is under the age of 16. And in some countries, and I think in the UK, the law is getting to the 12 years old. You really need to ask consent to the parents. So this introduced like more or less parent management or family management in that way. The whole idea of this is from out of the EU GDPR to give control back to the consumer for the use of his personal data. as it has to stay their data and not for a company to freely use for whatever reason and not protect well at the same time. So like Martin says, it's not enough to just ask consent with a tick box or a cookie. You really need to range a lot more than that. Then consent in PSD2, just a short summary of it, basically, because there's a lot around it. With PSD2, where financial information is disclosed to third parties, it's crystal clear that consumer needs to be asked for consent of sharing his financial data. This is very private data, so that does make a lot of sense. Using the data for marketing purposes is also, like race and religion in the GDPR use case, only possible with explicit consent. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. So if you just give consent of using your financial data, you don't give consent of using it for marketing purposes. So without consent, you have nothing. It's really a key topic for PSD2, and trusted TPPs, third-party payment service providers, will get easier consent from a consumer than untrusted ones. So it's really putting competitive edge to it. And most of the banks have to compete basically with these TPPs or become also a TPP in a way. Then another topic that has a large consent page is basically user managed access, UMA, which is a Kantara initiative draft standard. UMA will play a strong role when it comes to the exchange of personal data between two parties, all under the control of that same consumer. It will further strengthen the control of consumers over their personal data, and it will make life easier for them, as we all hate to exchange information by hand, photocopy, and more. We are living in this digital world anyway, and this part, exchange of personal information between different legal entities, different companies, is still quite immature. So here also for UMA, you have consent, and you have to have some consent management taking place. Then the one that is maybe less obvious is IoT. GDPR itself has an impact on IoT, and we have thought of that. Well, think twice. These devices contain a process personal data, and they are getting smarter in letting you use the outcome or in using the outcome for all kind of decision making, even marketing, to lower down the temperature of your house when you're not at home, till detecting if it's time to offer you a more suitable subscription on something. However, most IoT devices are just not smart enough to communicate difficult consent with the consumer itself. And for GDPR, you have to follow the right steps. No presumed consent, for instance, is allowed. This will mean that consent management needs to be outside the device, or the device needs to be much smarter. And if outside the device, you have to stay in a kind of a trusted circle or triangle between the consumer, the device, and whatever keeps track of the consent. So looking at consent and privacy regulation, it's pretty clear some things are really must-haves. If you don't comply, you risk a fine, a substantial fine. Most of these are already mentioned in the presentation of Martin. So on an attribute basis, per purpose, easily to withdraw, has to be freely given. And specifically looking at the US, needs to be opt-in, not what I standard use, opt-out. But there's also consent functionality that would give the user a better feeling around transparency, around privacy and data. And these are more in the nice to have. So mention here overview of all your consents that you gave, possibility to withdraw them at the same place. And a consumer would like to see when the consent is really being used, so an audit trail on it. But these are more like nice to have, as they are not really regulated. Now that we have seen that consent is getting everywhere, where should we put consent and consent lifecycle management? Well, our suggestion is as close to as you can get to the consumer and still protect everything in the proper way. The best way would be to add it to the My Profile page of the consumer itself, because that's where all the personal identifier information is. Extended with consent information, consent controls, preferably an audit trail they can read and understand. That system would then be the authoritative source in a way for PII and for consents. It's important to know that whatever you do with GDPR and or PSD2, and you have to do from a company perspective, the consumer will from 2018 onwards be in control. If they like it or not, if companies like it or not. Just be prepared, this is a big change. With all these consents, are we not getting into the same problems that we had with IAM access rights? You're never really fully in control. Maybe not, as we start pretty greenfield now, you have the opportunity to manage the life cycle from the start in a proper way. Manage the life cycle of consent ranging from extending the scope of use to multi-value consents and withdrawals. Let's call that life cycle management or consent lifecycle management, because that's basically what you're doing around consent, or what you should be doing around consent. Now let's go a little bit deeper in how we at iWelcome build in consent for the GDPR use case, but also for the other examples in a way. Multi-level consent per attribute. We created a flexible identity store and attached consent information right to the source. So you can't lose it, you will keep track of it, and it's always available for the consumer to view and for the company to use. So how does that look like? So how does the data model look like basically? What you see here is this typically old-fashioned golden record where you have things like first name, last name, date of birth. It could also be access to certain services or products, identification numbers, and you name it, size of your shoes. So it can be as much as you can think. It's information around the consumer itself. It's profile information. What we've done, and I've made in blue all the consent related things, we add a load of metadata to every attribute. So just a small box that you see here, but it could be a little bit over 100 items. So on every attribute, you have a whole set of metadata. Talking about expiration date, data classification, when it was last changed, who changed it. But in this case, in the blue area, where did the information came from? Was consent given to get it from there? Was the purpose approved? When did you consent it? And specifically when there's also parental control in place because the child is less than 16, if it is in place here, and who are the parents that control the consent. If you connect all this metadata to the identity record, this golden record, then everything is at one place. And if you have everything at one place, you're creating all that context around that data, and you can also enable it through APIs. So you can have policy-driven data management or consent management or any other APIs directly interfacing with the consumer's profile information. And this makes it very strong because everything will be in control, and things that are not allowed should not be able to just write things in the golden record. It will always go through the APIs, and it will always be policy based. And then to give access to the consumer, you will have a UI, UX to give that access. So a consumer can log into his profile page and see all this kind of information. You can visualize things like if things came from Facebook, if consent was given, if there's a data retention on it, you name it. And then on the right side, your applications, and of course also our applications in our identity as a service use these APIs in the same way. So it's all open. Then how does that look? This is the My Profile page. In the bottom side of the privacy page, you will find consents that were given, the purpose of it, when you accepted it, and will give you the possibility to change the consent, even to withdraw the consent. And as you can see, it's on an attribute level base. And then now we're looking a little bit more deeper into the future. So this is really just an example of a timeline. So looking forward to both UMA and IoT things, one will see, and this is future look into our product, that a timeline can create transparency on where your data is being used. It shows when you approved, paused, or withdraw consent, and it will allow you to immediately intervene if wrong things happen. In PSD2, one could keep track of what TPPs at that moment, with what purpose, requesting your classic bank for details on your savings account. So you really have track on what is going on. It will show for UMA what headhunter is requesting information from the university you went to, of course with your consent, but that was 2 years ago. So maybe withdraw that consent, or you should have made the consent with a shorter time life. Would you trust a company that is so transparent on the use of your personal data? Question yourself, if you're a company that offers this kind of transparency, would you, if you are the consumer also, feel this is more trustworthy? Because trust is really the key word here. If they trust you, then they're going to allow to do more service, they're going to share more of their information with you. You will know more around your customer. And for the customer or the consumer in this case, they are back in control, and hopefully they will like it. At least I would, but that's the thing that that will be upcoming. And thank you very much for listening to this presentation. And because I only got 20 minutes consent from Martin, I pass it back.
Okay, thank you, Corné. I think you're not even fully used sort of what I gave to you. Give me a second to switch over to moderator. Yes.
Yeah. We still have 20 minutes left, so.
Okay, so we still have a couple of minutes left, and so it's time for the Q&A session right now. We already have a couple of questions here, and I'm very open to receive more of these questions. So let's start with this one. So we talked a lot about purpose, and what is purpose related to? So it's just saying the entire business, or are it more generic things like I use it for marketing purposes, or I resell it, or I use it to manage your user experience? Or so what is the level of granularity we have to look at purpose?
Yeah.
Corné, could you answer that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we get it a lot. The thing with purpose is, and certainly in the past, they were like the examples you just mentioned. They were quite vague, so a company could do a lot with it. But that's not well informed, so it's not. It does not fulfill the requirements from the GDPR. So you have to be more precise. What is really the purpose? What's really the processing you will be doing with that data? And if it is for marketing purposes, you should say like it is for sending you a monthly newsletter. If it's for giving a better user experience, it would say that because of online profiling, you will give products that are more in line of their interest. So you have to be a little bit more precise. But yeah, going in very detailed, that would be a little bit too far. But yeah, better than you just did.
And clearly, as always with new regulations, there's some gray area.
Exactly. Yeah. So we'll find out where that gray area is.
But I think it's very clear that the area is not too big, that gray area. So it will change the way we have to deal with consent. So this is definitely one of the areas you have to change. Another question in here is, so if you already have data available from your customers, and so I think there are two scenarios. The one is clearly you have data collected and you want to add another purpose, then you need to consent for it. But what happens with the data you have before had collected before the GDPR becomes effective?
Yeah, you can't freely use that data. So you can use the data within the context of what was around that contract or the type of business that you've done with that consumer. But if there's anything that he could not think of himself, or that was not clear anymore, you have to go through the consent flows again, or you have to go through consent flows. So in a way, it's not freely like if I collected before the GDPR is in full force. By the way, it's already in full force now, but it's not enforced. It means you can't just use that for anything. That's not allowed.
Okay, there are so many questions coming in. Maybe that one fits well to the one thing you said. Is there a need to actively trigger the consumers for obtaining the consent? So yeah, it is. I would say very simple. Yes, you have to ensure the next time they come back, or if they don't come back, you have to inform them and say, okay, I want to add that purpose, and I need a consent. So there are a couple of, I would say, a number of things which really are around that. I think another interesting question I have is here. It appears as though consent is changing from a static to a dynamic concept. So how can a company manage numerous consent request programs and ensure the right consent is requested at the right time and at the right context? Yeah. I think this is a very interesting question. So particularly if you have different purposes, different divisions, different products and services, that can become rather complex.
Yeah, and it's a given that you will have it. Certainly when you look at the consumer being or customer being in your system for a couple of years, no doubt there will be additional consents you want to ask, and that could be on the same data. So it could be on the date of birth, for instance. So what we've done in our platform is a multi-value consent flow. So you have multiple purposes on the same attributes with specific consent, with the date consent was given. And we can give that consent through like OpenID Connect or OAuth requests towards the requesting web application that you offer to the consumer. So it is at hand, basically real time for immediate use by the application itself.
Yeah, I think that's one element. The other thing is I think it also goes to the organizational side of how do you deal with that. I touched the organization a little, and it's very clear you can't go out and say, I just let every department do it itself. You need to have a standardized central infrastructure. You should think about what are my sort of enterprise level policies. What are the things which are consistent across the entire enterprise? What are the things which are done not at the enterprise level, but at a regional level or a divisional level? And what are the things which have to be done at the level of an application? You need to implement a governance framework for that. So how could this framework look like? Which levels do you have? Which controls apply, etc.? So I've only seen it at one customer currently who really thought about it. So we advised them on that. But clearly, this is one of the challenges in this context. You need to understand where is the data, who is dealing with it, where is consent required, which other regulations apply, how do you do it in a consistent way so that you don't ask, for instance, a customer who is using a couple of services multiple times for the same consent. That also doesn't make any sense. So I think there are a number of very interesting things, and creating an organization on that definitely is one of the interesting and important areas here.
Yeah, you touched a good point there. So if different applications or different departments have different applications to offer to consumers, if they keep track of consents, then the consumer will get multiple consents. But if there's a system in between that basically needs to get that consent, then that system has the overall view of the consents that were already given. So will not request a second consent on the same kind of purpose. So it's really centralizing this, like we did with preference management in the past. Basically, consent management is just another thing. It's a little bit more complicated. It has more of a life cycle. And then you have the back-end systems. You already mentioned it. You need to really dive into where PII information is, how to keep track of it, if all that information has a purpose on it, if it's from out of contract point of view, you can use it. So this is a big exercise on the compliance side too, to the GDPR.
Yeah. And at the end, it's about, I think for that aspect and for the aspect of how can you get a complete view of your customer to also, for instance, revoke access to that data at a certain point of time. I think a very important aspect clearly is you need to have sort of a unified view on the consumer identity. So you need something to manage the consumer identity consistently, centralized, and to manage the consent around it. Okay, another question. So we have many questions here. Assuming I use a third-party data processor, is consent transferable, or does the third-party processor have to acquire consent by himself as well? Here it's important to differentiate, and Corné, you might add to this, between three involved groups of entities, might be organizations, might be persons. One is the data subject. That is the one whose data is collected. That's the one whose data is processed. It might be the customer. Then we have the data processor, and we have the data controller. Exactly. The data controller is the one who has to care for the consent. The data processor might be then the one who acts on behalf of the data controller.
Correct.
I think that's basically the play here. Corné?
Yeah, correct. And the data subject has to be asked consent by the data controller. And if he uses the processors for that, that's fine. But that's how it's done. So the TPP has to keep track of their own consents, and they can't pass on a consent to another company.
Exactly, because you give the consent to your data controller to do something with that.
Yeah, and that's a legal entity. And it doesn't pass, he can't pass it over to somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because that will be a data controller, and they have to ask the data subject themselves. So you can't just pass it through.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question, I think it's one I just recently had on another occasion, but I think it's an important one. So with the Brexit, is the UK still affected when they are not an EU member anymore? And what happens in between? Again, Corné, you might answer.
Yeah, well, Brexit is an interesting topic because you could think that the UK doesn't have to comply to the GDPR in 2018. But, I mean, it's all over the news. It will take them 2 years to really end the EU and really being loose from all the obligations that they have there. So still 2019, mid-2019, they will be have to be GDPR compliant. And after that, they still need to do business with European consumers, and they have to have an alike system as the GDPR. So we expect them to have something that is quite similar to that, to make it easier to for their business to do business with consumers.
And I think there are two aspects. The one is what about a business with EU resident data subjects? Mm-hmm. There, the GDPR always will apply, regardless of whether the UK is in or out. For doing business with non-UK, non-EU residents, the UK will have more flexibility. But to be realistic, and if you look at, for instance, at Singapore also has a very strict data protection law, which is not that far away from the GDPR. I think there might be some tendency based on that we see some sort of standardization at a higher level, because for doing business in certain regions, you will have to comply to very strict laws. And if you can comply to these laws, why not doing it sort of right everywhere? Clearly, it's then, and that's also an interesting point. So if you're doing business in certain regions, you might also need to be flexible and to say, okay, this one, that's the rules which apply here. Here we have to inform about terms and conditions in a different way than there, which again means you need some sort of a layer approach where you say, this is central, this is our baseline, what we do across the entire organization. And that region, we do this part differently, so maybe a little more lax on consent. In other regions, very strict on consent. There might be different attributes which are considered being very sensitive, and you need to really create an organization. And if you're a global organization, you have to have a global concept for dealing with privacy, with customer identity, with all the related stuff. That also, I think, goes back to another question which came in. So central consent management or siloed one, how does a good approach look like? So I think I just gave my answer. Corné, you might want to add here.
Yeah, the same answer basically. It's you can't go for a siloed approach. It will hurt not only you but also the consumer itself. So I wouldn't go for a siloed approach, but look for a central one.
Yeah, and not only look at it from a technical perspective, you have to understand who's in charge of what in that. So think about the organizational aspect, think about governance, create a consumer identity, and sort of consumer data, consumer privacy governance approach, define the controls and all that stuff. So we have still a couple of questions left open. What I propose is we take one last question. If you have more questions, just enter them, and we might then respond to the questions, particularly the ones we didn't answer, but maybe more in depth on some of the questions we had here. We might respond to them in a blog post we will publish at our website and maybe the iWelcome website as well within the next couple of days. So the final question I'd like to take here is, in what area of IT, also something we already discussed shortly, but not really in depth, does consent management fall? So is it more a CRM thing? Is it an identity management thing? Is it master data management for all the various, for creating one combined view on the consumer? So what is the right way to look at it?
Yeah, how we look at it is that you have to be close to the consumer because of the GDPR. He has to change his information, withdraw it, transport it, etc. So the data has to be anywhere close to the consumer. If you put consent in one of the systems that are more in the back, like an MDM, then it's not that easy to open that up for a consumer to change it. But it's not undoable to put it there. I would say closer to the consumer, and a CIAM solution or alike would be a good place to do it.
Yeah, and you should understand how this CIAM solution interfaces to your sort of enterprise or employee IAM for all the systems which hold some of the data or which might be accessed directly or indirectly as well. So look at it also from a bigger picture created strategy. So as I've said, we have a couple of questions left. We will cover these questions in a blog post. Right now we are close to the top of the hour, so I'd like to thank you very much to all the attendees of this KuppingerCole webinar. Thank you very much, Corné, for your presentation. I hope it was very interesting to you. There will be more events, and don't miss the European Identity and Cloud Conference, where GDPR also will play a very important role in the agenda. Thank you.